It is a good thing. It is a good
thing. The thing about it is, when I fix them, I know most of them. I can sing them. When you pick them, I just have to go along and do it. Well,
I don't know how to feel about that. That puts you in my shoes when Lottie's doing it. So now you understand. If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn it to Acts chapter 16. This is where we will spend our time today. This is going to be interesting, I hope. Maybe not, but one of the fascinating aspects of the gospel is that we look at it, we read the book of Acts, and we see the things that are happening. We follow the Apostle Paul, we follow Barnabas, we follow Silas, we follow all of these people as they move through these things. This particular time in history, and really we're coming up on Easter. Every bit of the time in history in which these things take place is not an accident. This is a very critical time, and I know there are people in this room who love history. We're going to spend a little time in that history today because it's critical to understanding how the gospel functioned, how it spread at this time in history. I'll begin reading in verse 1 of chapter 16. Paul came to Derbe and then to Lystra, where a disciple named Timothy lived, whose mother was a Jewess and a believer, but whose father was a Greek. The brothers at Lystra and Iconium spoke well of Timothy. Paul wanted to take Timothy on the journey, so he circumcised him because of the Jews who lived in that area, for they all knew that Timothy's father was a Greek. As they traveled from town to town, they delivered the decisions reached by the apostles and the elders in Jerusalem for the people to obey. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and grew daily in numbers. Now, the gospel spread here is not an accidental feature of what we're reading. It's tied into 300 years of history at this point. Paul and Silas, Barnabas and John Mark, they can move freely throughout the Roman Empire without any impediment. They don't have to go get a passport. They don't have to provide papers at checkpoints. Paul and Silas got in that boat and they sailed to Cyprus with Barnabas and John Mark, and there were no difficulties whatsoever for them. How is that? Well, 300 years and change prior to this very moment we're reading about today, Alexander the Great had conquered this entire region of the world. And he had done so because his desire was to spread the Greek culture that he loved to every corner of the known world at the time. Socrates, 5th century, 4th century BC, had a student. His name was Plato. Plato had a student. His name, 3rd century BC, 4th century BC, was Aristotle. Aristotle had a student, 4th century BC. His name was Alexander. So what Alexander was doing was taking the very teachings that Aristotle had given him and spreading them throughout the empire. So, think of it. Paul and Barnabas, Paul and Silas, John Mark, they traveled to Cyprus, and all of the known region of the world, there were many languages spoken. The Jews in Palestine spoke Aramaic. If you go to Carthage, they speak a different dialect. If you go, say, to the far reaches of the world, like Britain, which was part of the Roman Empire, they spoke a weird kind of Germanic Old English that none of us could understand today. All of these languages, but you could go anywhere in the empire, anywhere, and you could speak Koine Greek, and everybody understood you. Because Alexander had spread the Greek culture all over the known world. When the Roman Empire rose up and took over mostly everything that Alexander had conquered, the Greek language remained. And so people could take the gospel. They didn't have to go into a place and speak a certain language. They only had to speak one, because the Greek language, Koine Greek, the common, Koine means common, was a language that was the language of commerce. If you were going to buy and sell, you had to speak Greek. It's kind of like America. If you go to China, it always amazes. I feel stupid, personally. I got to tell you, I feel very stupid when I watch some Chinese person, native to China, speak English nearly as well as I do. And they still live in China. Why? Because the commerce that comes out of the United States and spreads around the world forces people, just so that they can make a living, to speak English. as a second language. Paul probably was trilingual at this point in history. We know he spoke Greek, we know he spoke Hebrew or Aramaic, and he probably spoke Latin as well, because Latin was the language of the aristocracy and of the government. All of this was because Alexander had done what he had done, changed the world. Now, the Roman people, or the Roman government, I should say at this time, if we think about Rome, we think about them as an enemy. They were not an enemy. The fact that Paul and his band could travel as they did was because all was under the umbrella of Roman rule, and all the laws applied everywhere. It's just like you and me. If I want to go to Florida, I don't have to go change my money. I don't have to sign papers. They don't stop me down there at the state line and look through my car. They don't do any of that. This is because we're all under one umbrella, that is the United States. The Roman Empire was the empire. So they could travel with the gospel wherever they wanted without any impediment. And Rome was very tolerant. You know what they saw Christianity as? They didn't understand Christianity. At this point in history, we're talking here around 40 AD, they didn't know what it was. All they knew was, they did know of it. They knew that it was an offshoot from Judaism. That's what they thought. These are a different kind of Jewish people. Yeah, the Jews are kind of troublesome because they're clamorous and they make trouble, but it's okay, because in the Roman Empire you could be anything you wanted. If you wanted to worship Zeus, you could worship Zeus. If you wanted to worship at the temple of Aphrodite, and speaking as a man, there were all kinds of incentives to that particular aspect of worship. If you went to the temple of Aphrodite, there were hundreds of temple prostitutes awaiting your entrance into the building. So you could see why that particular church might be very full every day that they met. But these features of the Roman Empire were such that you could pretty much do whatever you wanted, and the Romans left you alone. They don't care. As long as you pay taxes and don't make trouble, we don't care what you are. There was a problem, though, and this is where I want to funnel this down for you and me today. The Roman Empire, because of all of these varying belief structures, which were all okay, the people, what happens to people when you have what we have, pluralism, which is there are all these worldviews and they're all equally okay. We don't care what you think or believe as long as you pay your taxes and don't make trouble. What happens is, through generations, people growing up in that kind of feature of humanity, that feature of culture, they don't have any meaning for anything they're doing. If a person's not anchored to something that says, this is why I'm here on the earth, then you and I and everybody just become pieces of furniture in the universe. The Roman Empire created that. For most people, they went to their job, they did whatever they did. There was no sense of purpose for what they're doing. I'm here now, I was born, I've grown to this point in my life, and I'm doing my job, and I've got children that depend on me, and then I'm going to die, and that's it. And so that was all of the perspective they had with regard to what life means. Why are we here? What are we doing? Where's life going? For the Roman, it didn't matter. You're just here, and that's it. So the gospel came in and told people who were thinking like that their lives didn't matter, they're just furniture, Jesus died for you. God Almighty cares about you so much that He came and He's going to redeem you through what Jesus did on the cross. Do you want that? You know you've done things wrong. We could say that to anybody. I'd say it to myself. I know that I have violated my own conscience. What does that mean? I knew I shouldn't have done it, but I did it anyway. All of us know that. They knew that. And so when somebody comes to them with the gospel and says, yes, God knows you did that too, but He's made a way for you to be forgiven for all of that, to start anew. Who doesn't want that? So these people were hungry to be something more than furniture. If you go to the country of India, and this is a kind of a side note, but it's interesting to me, and you talk to an Indian who's a Christian, How did you become a Christian? Well, my grandparents were Christians. How did they become a Christian? Well, their parents were Christians. How did they become Christians? They were threatened with death by the Portuguese Inquisition. They said, we stuck a bayonet in my great-great-great-great-grandfather's face and said, you either convert or die. Which do you choose? Well, that's an easy choice. The bayonet in my face makes the choice for me. But the Indians then turned back and said, we want this. We don't care how it came, because this Jesus tells me, who was a member of the Dalit class, the untouchable, that I'm not just a piece of furniture here. My life really matters. And the Indians flocked to the missionaries because of that. They flocked to them. So here we got Timothy. They come to this place, and Timothy is a disciple, the text says. How did that happen? Well, 5 years before this happened, you remember Paul sailed to Cyprus with Barnabas. And Paul got stoned, they thought, to death. Remember? They stoned him to death. He's laying there. They dragged him outside the city so that if the Romans got wind of the fact that they killed somebody, the Romans, they just say, we don't know what happened to him. He died out there. We don't even know who he is. Timothy, it says in the text, if you go back and read the account of Paul's stoning at Lystra, what does it say? The disciples gathered around Paul thinking him dead. The only one who's supposed to be there is Barnabas. So it doesn't say that. It doesn't say Barnabas. It says the disciples. Why? Timothy was one of those people standing there. He'd been converted. His grandmother was a Christian. His mother had been converted. And Timothy, look, here's where God is so wise that he harnesses evil and turns it into good for somebody's life. Who was standing there holding the cloaks of all of the Jews while they stoned Stephen? Paul. Saul. Paul. The next text is Paul's on his way to Damascus with papers to arrest more Christians, and God shows up and says, how long will you kick against the goads? He saw Stephen stoned to death. God let Paul see that. Stephen's death wasn't for nothing. Paul became a believer. Timothy saw Paul stoned to death. And then Paul gets up and goes back into town right where he came from, where they just stoned him. Timothy saw that. So did Timothy's grandmother. So did Timothy's mom. And now here they are, believers. Now the fascinating thing here is Paul takes him and circumcises him. They've had the Council of Jerusalem where they said, you don't have to do this to the Greeks. It's not a requirement. The law of Moses, you let it go. All you got to do is stay away from things polluted by idols and blood, and the rest of it, you're on your own. God will tell you what to do. Don't worry about any of this. And they circumcised Timothy. Why? Paul knows that you've got this mixed marriage. Timothy's father is a Greek. Okay, to you and me that's okay, so what? Well, if Paul had taken Timothy into the synagogues, which they're going to do, as we will see as we go forward in time, as they have done, he knows that no Jew in that audience will see Timothy as anything but a half-breed mongrel, and they will not listen to him. Won't pay him any attention. So he circumcises him, not because of the law, but because of the Jews. And what's so incredible about that is, if think about it, he goes into a church, let's say he goes into a congregational meeting, and there are 25 Greeks and 30 Jews, and some people in between. The Greeks don't care whether he's circumcised or not. They don't care. The Jews care. They will both listen to Timothy now. So you've got this incredible wisdom where Paul is being wise beyond what you would think would be wise. The Jerusalem council said, don't worry about it. Paul circumcises him not because of the council and not because of the law, but because he knows Timothy won't be heard. Now, why was the gospel so well received? People are living in the universe just like you and me, and it's an impersonal place. Have you ever thought about this? If you and I go outside and the moon is coming up on, say, a harvest moon night, big full moon, you look out there, you see it, you think, man, isn't that beautiful? The moon doesn't know you're there. The moon doesn't know you're there. The stars don't know you and I are here. We're looking at them. We appreciate them. There is a vast difference between the matter that you and I are and the matter that the stars are. In all the universe's grandeur, the universe doesn't know we're here. We know the universe is there. The universe is an impersonal place. So if there's no God, we're just bits of matter floating through the universe to come and go, and it doesn't make any difference that we're even here to the universe. That's what the Roman culture was like at this time in history. That's why when Paul spoke about the unknown God, which we'll see in a few weeks, to the pagans, they listened to him because he was saying something to them that said, you really matter. The pagan deities, what you wanted, if you were a worshiper of Zeus, you know what you wanted? You wanted Zeus to not know you were around. You didn't want Zeus to know you were even there. You wanted Zeus off your back because the pagan gods are worse than we are. Zeus ate his children. I mean, how many of us would go along with that as an idea? How many of us would say that that sounds like a god that we could worship? You didn't want the gods to notice you if you were a pagan. But Paul says, I'm introducing you to a God who loves you, who sent Jesus to die for you, and you can have a relationship with the maker of the universe. Your life really does matter. Anytime you take away the true and the living God, what you wind up with is superstition. Go anywhere in the world and look at any world religion or any pagan belief whatsoever. There's no God. The maker of the universe is not part of that equation. And what you will see is people worshiping animals, sacrificing things to volcanoes, doing all kinds of things to appease these deities they don't know anything about so that the deities will leave them alone. Can you imagine what a refreshment it is to hear? No, he really loves you. The one who really made all of this loves you, and he will have a relationship with you. You can call on him wherever you are for whatever reason, and he will listen to you. Holy cow. I mean, and think of it this way. This is the culture we live in today. It is. What are we told? The only way you can know anything for sure is by scientific knowledge. If you can't prove it in an experiment, then it's probably not real. Well, what does that say? That says that you and I are nothing but bits of matter, that the same forces that coughed up the moon and the stars and everything else coughed us up. And we don't matter. Think of it for just a moment here, in a big way. Your life and my life, all right? We raise children, we do the things we do. If the universe is like that, who cares what we do? Why does it matter at all what we do? If all we are bits of matter coughed up by the same forces that coughed up the trees and the grass. It doesn't matter. And in that sense of impersonality, there are millions of people living their lives every day thinking their lives don't matter. The gospel is just as relevant today as it was when Paul and Silas took it to Lystra. Just as relevant. And if you don't believe it, click on a television sometime and see how many times you see everybody from Oprah to Chopra showing up, giving you and me some kind of spirituality, some kind of method to reach the ultimate. Not Jesus, but something so that we can hold on to something. Pick up. This is the 21st century, right? Got a thing you can hold in your hand that's got 10 times more computing power than they had on the limb when it landed on the moon. More computing power in your hand than the whole of NASA had when they landed Neil Armstrong on the moon. And there's a horoscope that shows up in my email every day. That if I'll just look at what the horoscope says for me that day, it's going to tell me something. People want to think, want to know that there's something beyond themselves that's real. They want it. We want it. We're built for that. As Augustine said, there is a God-shaped cavity in every human being, and we're restless until God fills it. He's exactly right. So the beauty of all this is we have a message that transcends the personal problem. It also transcends the universal problem. Our universe, according to science, is going to decay into nothingness. It's going to keep expanding. And as it does, everything's getting so far apart that the light from the other objects in the universe aren't even going to reach us. The sky, if we live, the sky will just be black. Or the sun is going to swell into a red giant and incinerate us. And things will keep expanding until the universe will just be a dead cold place with a lot of debris floating around and no meaning to it whatsoever because there'll be no life. Now, that's the scientific story. I'm going to say, God thinks about it a little differently. He looks at it and says, I'm superintending all of this, and I'm superintending you. And the universe will not die like that. And if it does, it won't matter. When the mountains are flat, if you come to Jesus, you will live. I will live. God is going to win in his universe. And I want to close with just a little passage of scripture here that speaks to this so powerfully to me, better than I could say it. Paul says to the church at Ephesus, speaking to the Ephesian Greek pagans who were formerly Greek pagans, he says, remember that you, the Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision by that which is called circumcision, which is in the flesh made by hands. You were at one time separate from God, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of the promise, having no hope with no God in the world. That's the whole earth. But now, in Christ Jesus, you who were once far off are made near in the blood of Christ. That's the promise he holds for every person in this room, for every person on earth, if they'll just take it. We don't have to just be furniture. Our lives really matter. And God will superintend how the universe goes. We don't have to worry about that. And when the mountains are flat, if I can take Jesus at his word, Rip Snow will live. I don't know